What you typically get out the gates from many people is you have to be Pan-African day one. But it's just non-trivial, right? And a lot of the stuff that we're trying to solve at Stitch is to enable people to plug into us, and they won't have to worry about these geographic complexities. These are very relevant Pan-African problems. But you do need to sink your teeth into one market, and then you do need to work out some sort of model and scale from there.
Hi everyone, it's Julie Verhage Greenberg here with your Tux Time podcast from FinTech Today, where we talk about all things FinTech. In this episode, I am joined by Kiaan Pillay of Stitch Money, an API FinTech based in South Africa. And we have not had FinTech companies from Africa on that much. We had Visa on from Chipper a few months ago, but I love learning about what's going on in this ecosystem because I just find it super fascinating. So Kiaan, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Very excited to be on. We are big fans of yours. We watched. We're friends of Visa as well, and we were very excited that he managed to get on, and we were a bit jealous. So happy to be here.
There we go. Now it all came full circle then. So tell me a little bit about Stitch Money, because I have heard a little bit about you guys from Charlie Ma, one of our FTT experts, who is also an investor in you guys. But I would love to dive a little bit deeper on that first.
Yeah, absolutely. At Stitch, we essentially provide a set of developer tools and APIs, and really the idea is to make it easy for apps to connect to financial accounts, and broadly across African markets, really with the idea to make it simple for developers to build and scale financial products. I think there is somewhat of a cheesy narrative in the world at this point that 20 years ago it was really difficult to build internet businesses, right? And you had to mount server racks yourself, and you had to build card and SMS, and then all these great API companies came about, such as AWS and Stripe and Twilio, and made it really easy to build internet businesses. And I think the likes of Plaid and Tink and TrueLayer really opened up the ability to build financial businesses in Western markets, in the US and in European markets. And in most cases, and I hate to generalize and say in Africa, but in most African markets, it is still ludicrously difficult to build any sort of financial business. You're still doing it in many ways. Hard was done 15 years ago by knocking on the door of a bank and having to handle the compliance yourself. And so really that's what we do. We kind of want to be a single point of access that people can just plug into us, and out the box they can kind of get going.
So you led me into something else that I wanted to ask about, is which areas of Africa are you guys in? I know it's part of South Africa, but there's obviously many different markets there. And how did you go about choosing that? Because like you mentioned, it's very different from market to market. It's not just Africa as a whole.
Yeah, so great question. I think we have always viewed this as a very pan-African opportunity. Myself and a bunch of the team have spent a lot of time in many African markets. To date, and this is a very well-timed question, up until today, we were only live in South Africa. So we started in South Africa, and I think primarily just because most of us are South African, we are in South Africa. I think, largest financial market in Africa. So it is a really interesting market to start and to go deep in. We have just announced that we've launched in Nigeria today, which is a fantastic market and a fascinating market for many reasons. Tremendous fintechs coming out of the market, huge amount of venture capital coming to the market, and you're seeing fintech start and scale really quickly. So for now, in South Africa, have just announced Nigeria today, but plan to be in what we consider some of the at least 5 major markets in Africa by end of next year. So South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, and Egypt by end of next year.
And how did you go about choosing those? Are they just markets that you saw the biggest need and the biggest market potential, I guess?
Yeah, so I think a few things. I think why Africa or African markets are so interesting to kind of choose from, or so difficult, is that they're so unique. Every market has a different level of maturity in terms of how much adoption there is for financial accounts, how digital people are, what cash penetration is like, regulation. So for a few things, I think One, and perhaps an overarching one we use in all markets, is in all of those markets, you actually just see a tremendous amount of fintechs being started in all of these markets, right? And I think, one, it's a huge challenge to just start, as mentioned, for the compliance, infrastructural, sort of cost reasons. But two, being able to scale them is non-trivial, right? Like to scale in an individual market is non-trivial. And if you want to go pan-African, even more complex. And one thing that we particularly want to solve is that we handle that complexity, right? Like people build, and out the gates, day one, they can just talk to us, and we'll be able to solve some of these problems for them. So particularly, the two developers in their room right now sitting and trying to build something, you just see a huge amount of activity, and a lot of that has to do with the maturity in many cases of developers, right? Like the years of experience of developers in all of those markets is actually just in most cases a tick above other African markets. And so you do just see a lot more financial applications being started there, which is just like where we typically see most of our success and early adopters.
So you speak about adopters quite a bit. In the US, fintech was almost like sort of slow to take off. People were like, well, it's my money. Like, do I really want to trust these people to, handle it? And I'm obviously speaking mostly on the B2C side, but B2B often is intertwined with how much is going on in the B2C space as well. Like Plaid wouldn't have been quite as successful if fintech wouldn't have been a big thing for consumers. What does adoption look like in different areas of Africa?
Yeah, great question. So I think completely case by case, right? Like South Africa actually has huge bank adoption. South Africa, in many ways, looks very similar to the States. We're actually over 80% bank penetrated, which is huge compared to other African markets. So in SA, in many cases, you do see a huge population that are banked. You see a huge population that are digitally transacting and making payments. In Kenya, you see M-Pesa, which is like one of the greatest, fintech success stories in the world, right? Everybody is digitally transacting there. I think Nigeria is a fascinating market where there are a variety of ways that people transact right there. There's a large bank population, very rapidly growing fintech adoption across all the like big buckets in fintech products: lending, savings, crypto, investments, person to person. So I think you see it case by case. What's so fascinating is adoption doesn't just mean bank, and it doesn't just mean fintech, right? Like Kenya is such a great example of this, where it is a completely thriving financial digital ecosystem, and like bank is a very small portion of that, right? It's M-Pesa, it is mobile money, and so like really case by case. In many markets, there are 3, 4, 5 different ways people can transact, but really like market to market dependent.
So you've done a very good job of leading me into my next questions. I promise this was not planned or anything.
Sure.
But crypto you mentioned. What does adoption look like for crypto, NFTs, and all of that over there? Because obviously in the US it's this really big thing right now, but I haven't really checked out if people in Africa are minting their own NFTs and like making accounts on Coinbase or like the Coinbase equivalent in Africa.
Yeah, great question. So I'd probably be speaking out of turn if I spoke to every market, but in some of the markets, that we spend a lot of time in, there's huge crypto adoption. A few years ago, it was reported that South Africa was one of the largest crypto markets in the world per capita, like one in every however many South Africans. I think we actually
Wow.
had the highest number. I believe, and again, I might be speaking out of turn, that Nigeria was one of the top 5 largest cryptocurrency markets in the world, at the start of this year. So you do see huge adoption, not only from like individuals that are doing it in a decentralized and person-to-person way, but you do get like a ton of really sizable players in the market. Luno is one of the largest players in. Well, Luno actually are like one of the largest crypto exchanges in the world, full stop. But their largest market is South Africa, and I believe they do a huge amount of volume through Nigeria as well. So a huge amount of adoption. What is really interesting, and like Nigeria specifically had this massive crypto population, but had huge regulation put in place that stopped centralized exchanges from operating. And over the night, you see like this huge step change in actually how easy it is to operate with what, is meant to in many ways open up a financial product and ecosystem. And you just see that in many African markets. And I think that that's actually one of the nuances and plays to the fragmentation. That regulation is just different in every market, right? And you think crypto, you think Bitcoin, it's obviously more complicated than this, but it's trying to unlock things and open things up. But you see like a regulator in one market, come in and stamp their foot. It gets very challenging in some cases. So it is large, but not without hiccups. But I suppose that does happen in sort of every market.
I suppose you're probably right. Sticking on the various market trends, people like to throw around like plaid for X or even like plaid for X country quite a bit. Does that hold true in all parts of Africa? Or are you really seeing that like it's certain parts and that's why you're taking like this, country by country approach?
Yes, I think we've historically tried to stay away from like the plaid for X or the plaid for Africa. I'm probably the biggest fanboy out there of plaid, so certainly actually like are flattered in many ways of the comparison, but I think just misses some of the nuance in many of these markets, right? I think it is fair in some markets, and I think we've shied away from it, but it's probably most fair in South Africa, right? Like South Africa is over 80% banked. Like we actually look very similar to the US. And what we do in South Africa is we just connect to bank accounts, right? Which is very similar, obviously, to what plaids do in the States. I think when you start to look, one, there are 54 African markets, right? Like when you talk about like scaling Pan-African, there are just so many geographies. And there are so many different kinds of financial accounts. It can almost be a bit reductive to look at it as like a plaid for X. We do definitely see merit in being, hey, we want to be the connectivity. People want to talk to us, and we're able to connect to 4, 5, 6 different types of institutions. But I think there's mobile money, there's bank, there's walleting solutions. There are the fintechs themselves that in many cases people use them from the first time as they go to cash to digital for the first time. People often use fintechs as like a store of value, right? And like before they go to a bank. So I think we err away from it a little bit just because there's such nuance in each of these markets. I think certainly resonate with the access connectivity piece and making it easy for people to do this. But the direct connection to like bank or investment accounts falls a little bit short on some of the African context.
What do investors who are now, like you mentioned earlier in the podcast, like Africa is a very hot market as it was not, even just a few years ago. What do investors still not get about the African ecosystem though?
Yeah, great question. I actually have been, if you asked me this question like 6 months ago or 6 months before that, I'd have different answers. And I've actually been very impressed with how quickly people have got up to speed with a lot of the African context and nuance. I think what you do see sometimes, and where it's different, is exactly what I just mentioned now on the last question, right? It's an exceptionally large continent, 54 markets, and I think what you typically get out the gates from many people is you have to be Pan-African day one. Right. And I completely appreciate that. And I do understand that sentiment. The reality is you probably can't build, the $50 billion fintech in, Ghana alone. Right. You probably do want to scale into many markets. But it's just non-trivial. Right. And that's, I think, a lot of the stuff that we're trying to solve at Stitch is to enable people to plug into us and they won't have to worry about these geographic complexities. But there is just a certain baseline that it's challenging to scale into these markets. I used to be at a Pan-African API company before this, Smile Identity, and we had the same issues, right? Like we totally believed, at Stitch and at Smile that these were very relevant Pan-African problems. But you do need to sink your teeth into one market, and then you do need to work out some sort of model and scale from there. So I think sometimes those expectations can be off at how quickly you can scale Pan-African, and we hope to kind of smooth some of that over. And I do actually think to like counter some of that, you actually have seen huge businesses built in single markets, right? They might not look quite traditionally venture-backed in some cases, but Fowry in Egypt, M-Pesa in Kenya, right? Those are cases that prove like you can actually build really large fintechs in single markets. So I think sometimes that's mistaken too. And then I also think maybe just some of the understanding around like really early stage stuff specifically. I think you're getting to the point now actually where a lot of businesses are proving themselves and are raising these 50-100 million dollar rounds, which are phenomenal. But there just isn't as prominent of an angel ecosystem or like pre-seed angel type ecosystem here, because you haven't had a huge amount of exits or success stories where people can start giving back. And I think that's starting now. We have a bunch of angels that have been at successful African fintechs, which we're incredibly proud of. But it's still very nascent, and that isn't completely distributed throughout the ecosystem, or it isn't distributed even evenly in terms of geographies. So like actually going from zero to like a little bit of capital to get off the ground is just very challenging.
And what is the fundraising environment? You guys have raised like a couple of rounds at this point, still like very, very early days, but you have raised some money at like different points. How has that changed over the past 6 to 12 months? Because like you mentioned in the start of your answer to that last question, if I would have asked you what investors do and do not get about the environment, a year ago, it'd be very different than what it is today.
Yeah, so this is so we've been around for like plus minus 2 years. I think we've had such an interesting lens on this. So we've raised a little bit of money almost equally in 6-month increments over those 2 years. So we did a pre-seed, and then we did like a angel type round, safe type round 6 months after that, and then we officially did a seed 6 months after that, and then we did an extension of the seed 6 months after that. And so when we started. We know a bunch of people that really struggle to raise money. We got very lucky and we raised money, I think in, what I would only define as a bit of an unfair advantage, because I had spent quite a lot of time in San Francisco, and almost all of our money in our pre-seed round came from investors that I had known from networks there, or directly from Smile Identity, which is the company that I used to work at. And specifically, those were African-focused investors, right? There are maybe a handful, five 2 years ago, of like funds that just did Africa. A few of them participated in our pre-seed round, and that was it, right? I think they're really high caliber funds, but those were the people you talk to. 6 months after that, we almost entirely raised a small round just from angels, right? And very interestingly, they were angels of successful fintechs, right? It was, the founder of Venmo, some of the founding team at Plaid, some of the founding team at Revolut. And I thought that was quite interesting, that there was this like cabal of, fintech operators that were suddenly saying, hey, something in Africa is interesting. And then 6 months after that, we raised our seed round, and we definitely had more access to just, you can talk to the African investors, but there was a ton of hesitation, right? Like we actually did talk to quite a few firms, and there are a lot of people that look at this and say, "Ooh, we just don't quite get Africa yet." But we did have a much easier round then. And then, fast forward 6 months, everybody wants to invest in Africa. All of a sudden, like all of the interest is inbound. I think everybody is looking to understand Africa. People are very honest about their understanding and how they want to get involved, which I think is just great. And that's been amazing. Like just, like top tier US VCs already starting to look at the continent. I only, expect that to increase, which has just been incredible watching that journey and just like see it open up a ton.
So if anyone wants to find out more about what you guys are up to, or just, follow along on your journey, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so I definitely go to our website. We just released a new website today, so stitch.money, or you can follow us on Twitter at StitchMoneyHQ, where we have just started getting good about posting updates. So those are probably the best two spots to find us.
Awesome. And if anyone wants to follow along on broader fintech, Africa, and elsewhere in the world, go to fintechtoday.co and sign up for our newsletter. Otherwise, Kiaan, thank you so much for joining us. This was great.
Thanks, Judy. This is awesome. Thank you so much for having me.